Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today I'm going to be talking with Yale Law professor Zach Liscow, who used to be the chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget at the federal government. And he and I are going to talk about DOGE. We're going to talk about infrastructure spending. We're going to talk about government efficiency generally. And then we'll talk about some myths and truths about the tax code, and essentially like questions like, do rich people actually pay less in taxes? How do they evade taxes? How could we reform the tax code, etc.? But before we get there, I just want to lay out a couple thoughts. I first want to just talk a little bit about this question of the Department of Government Efficiency and the larger efforts around Elon Musk and Trump to as they say it, root out inefficiencies and corruption within the government. And I come at this, and I talk with Zach about this a little bit. If you listen to this podcast long enough, I've been spending a lot of time on the question of making government more efficient. So like the big picture goal of trying to, bring more money to the taxpayers, or at least in the case of the federal government, decrease the deficit, because before we return money to the taxpayers, we need to ensure that we're not leaving future generations with a huge bill. That is a good goal. The question I have asked myself is, are they genuinely solving this problem? And I think I have a couple of major questions and issues with what I'm seeing so far. And I think it starts with tax cuts. Right now, the Senate and the House of Representatives are debating legislation that will in all likelihood extend and probably expand existing tax cuts at a time when we have a growing federal deficit, which is, last time I checked, is something on the order of 10% of our deficit is, or 10% of our budget is interest on our debt, which is rising every year. And some people say it might be the fastest growing government program. And so what that means is that at this time where Elon Musk and people around him are going around the federal government pointing at this program, that saying returning money to the taxpayer, that party and that government at the same time are about to enact more tax cuts that is going to, dramatically dwarf anything that they cut within the government. And that's before you start talking about whether these are good cuts or bad cuts, or they're cuts to the right programs, et cetera. And so essentially what's going on here is not that money is being returned to the taxpayer after all of these changes. It's actually that we're taking more money out of the pockets of taxpayers when you put all of this together. And in particular, it's the worst kind, because basically what we're doing is we're taking money out of the pockets of our children and our grandchildren. That's whose money we're spending right now. And in all likelihood, and this was the case of the Bush administration as well, and the first Trump administration, the deficit will grow more. And in all likelihood, it's going to grow a lot more based on what we're seeing so far. And The Economist did some good reporting on this. And I'll quote from this article that they have, where they have an article saying that Elon Musk is failing to cut American spending. And this is what the article says. It says, every working day, the Treasury publishes a statement detailing withdrawals of cash from its primary deposit account, providing the best high-frequency indicator of government spending. Since Donald Trump took office a little more than 3 weeks ago, outlays have averaged $30 billion a day compared with the same period last year under Joe Biden. Federal spending came back then to about $26 billion a day. Outflows from the Treasury have actually risen since January 28th, when Mr. Musk first claimed that his Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, was saving the federal government $1 billion a day. Looking at the bigger picture, the government's spending trajectory in the current fiscal year, which began in October, basically resembles that of past years. And then it goes on to talk about how Musk has promised over $2 trillion in annual saving from the federal government, and says that there's just no way he's going to get anywhere near that, in large part because of the way that the government is structured. And this is something I talked with Zach about, which is most of this money is in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And there's almost no chance that this government is going to make significant reforms to any of those programs, maybe Medicaid, because that seems to be politically, to them, it seems more politically sellable. Although I do think it's dangerous, because there's a lot of poor rural Republicans out there who depend upon Medicaid. I saw this firsthand in Mississippi. Never mind the ethical questions about whether at a time when you're cutting taxes for people who make a lot of money, that you should be restricting what in a lot of cases are pretty meager healthcare expenditures for the poorest people in this country, including poor children, right? We'll put that to the side. But the bottom line is we're talking about pennies of savings from a lot of the changes being pondered right now from Musk at a time when you're talking about major changes in the opposite direction when it comes to tax cuts. And so far, this DOGE effort to me seems more theater than it is actual deficit reduction, but theater with a real cost. And I think when you look at USAID, this is a good example. I have no doubt that there are dumb programs in USAID, and by all means cut those. But the idea that you cut the entire department, I think, is dangerous. And a good example here is, there's reporting on Malawi where PEPFAR, which is a program that George W. Bush dramatically expanded and in some cases was responsible for saving millions and millions of lives around this country. They pay for antiretroviral drugs in sub-Saharan Africa. And this program is a large reason why life expectancy has risen from 45 in the year 2000 to 63 in 2022 in Malawi. In South Africa, the U.S. government spends about $440 million every year to fight HIV and TB. And in a lot of these cases, there are groups and organizations out there on the ground who receive grants from the federal government to administer these drugs, who overnight were faced with the prospect of not having the funds to exist anymore and to administer these drugs. Now, we can argue one way or the other about whether these programs should exist or not. But if you're the most powerful country in the world, if you want to be a moral leader in the world, that is not how you should conduct business, right? If you're going to pull life-saving drugs from people in desperate situations that you have been providing since a lot of the people listening to this podcast were children, right? So if you've been providing those drugs that long and you're just going to pull the rug out from under those organizations and those people overnight, then you're not the moral leader in the world, right? If you're gonna cut those programs, if you're gonna scale down those programs, there's a responsible way to do it. I would argue that you should not cut those programs. You should not scale down those programs. Yes, there's dumb programs within USAID that you can cut. This isn't one of them. But if you are going to cut them and you say that you're the moral leader, then there's a way to do that. And this is not the way to do that. And I think this is part of a larger pattern in this administration, which is this herky-jerky approach, where even a lot of these changes are dramatic compared even to the first Trump administration. And I think a moral leader in the most powerful country in the world, an ethical government, an organized government, even an effective government, needs to do a few things. Number one, it needs to take its promises seriously. And what I just described is a series of promises. Our alliances are promises, right? Our alliance with Canada, our alliance with Europe, our defense of Ukraine. These are promises. And so if you're going to renege on those promises or change your commitments, there's a responsible way to do it that gives respect to your allies. And you should be really careful about ever reneging on those promises or changing them. But if you do, you should do it with care. I'm not seeing that. Number two is a sense of truth, right? So when it comes to taking these anecdotes about what's working and what's not, and selling this idea that we're returning money to the taxpayers, right? You should be truthful about that, which is you may kind of return money to taxpayers if you enact tax cuts, but what you're really doing is borrowing from future generations. So you should be truthful to people about that. And I think third is when you're going about this work of cutting different programs, you have to be organized and you have to be competent, right? Competency is really critical when you're going through longstanding programs out there, right? There's a general principle out there where, if you're removing something, whether it's from government or anything, like let's say it's like a metaphorical bridge and you're removing a brick, you should really know the function that brick plays within the larger infrastructure before you remove it, and really do the work to say, I really understand the purpose of this brick. And I think in certain cases where we see reporting that people who are in charge of safeguarding the nuclear arsenal or or certain programs like Medicaid, for poor people in the most desperate situations in this country, or very critical government employees across the board who are either being fired, furloughed, et cetera. And then where you're having these emergency declarations where the government's trying to bring these people back, right? Or in the case of the USAID example that I had, where Rubio is having to rush to do emergency declarations to try to get some of that funding flowing again, while some of these organizations are saying that they may not exist by the time the funding comes back to them, right? This just shows to me that you haven't thought through all the things that you're doing and that you're not showing competency, right? And that is a big problem when you're pushing as much disruption as you're pushing here, without a lot of benefit in the grand scheme of things for the taxpayer, especially when coupled with some of the other fiscal decisions that you're making. So I would say that at the moment, I'm not impressed by the efforts of DOGE. And I do think that we're playing with fire here. And I think this gets to a general climate that we have in this country where we just take things for granted. We take for granted that we have allies and that we have great relationships with countries around the world, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or Europe or to our northern border. We just take that for granted, right? We don't know what it's like to be booed when we, when our teams travel the country or when we're tourists in other countries. It's been a long time since people have treated us with a level of venom that we're about to face right now. Never mind if we get ourselves into another war, like Afghanistan, where we're trying to push our allies like Canada to go fight alongside us, or if we have another global pandemic and we need to coordinate with people, or if there's a global recession and we need to coordinate with people. We may need help at some point. That's what allies are for, right? And I think we just take for granted that those allies have always been there. And I think we're about to learn what things look like otherwise. We also take for granted that, like, for much of this 21st century, whether it's polio, measles, the mass devastation of AIDS, right? People used to live in much different circumstances. Polio outbreaks could paralyze children overnight. Measles could kill or disable millions of people before the vaccines wiped those out. In the early days of the AIDS epidemic, entire communities were destroyed. Entire countries were basically ungovernable for periods of time and were faced with mass extinction. Even in the U.S., my mom was a nurse on a HIV/AIDS ward. You would see like entire communities devastated here, and people were just delivered death sentences. We're playing with fire here, both within the public health infrastructure, our overall government, our alliances. And I think this is largely being driven by this sense that things are always going to be great, no matter what we do, no matter what, whatever, no matter what bricks we pull from the bridge is always going to be standing. And I think that we're facing down the possibility that a lot of people are going to be delivered some hard lessons here about what life used to be like in this country. And you could extend this out, whether it's nuclear accidents, air accidents, protectionism, the tariffs, the economy, right? A lot of people, especially younger people, they haven't been through a recession, never mind a depression. They haven't been through the HIV/AIDS crisis. They haven't been through polio, measles. They haven't been through a trade war before. And things are about to change here. Or they have a significant likelihood of changing in ways that are about to create a generation of people who are going to know hardship on a whole different level and who are going to experience the global reality of what it means to be America with a much different standing in the global community than what they're used to. And I think perhaps only then will people begin to understand the importance of some of these institutions, alliances, and relationships, and just the moral authority that we used to take for granted in this country. So with that, let's jump into this interview with Zach Liscow from Yale Law School, formerly Chief Economist of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, where we're going to talk about DOGE, infrastructure, and taxes. Let's jump right in. Well, Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Zach, I don't know when the last time I saw you was, but we met each other back in the summer of, 2005 in Washington, D.C. We lived in the dormitories in Hall at George Washington University.
Yes.
there were two types of students. We're in the same program together. There were two types of students. There were those of us who were going to Georgetown every night and drinking too much. And then there were the serious people like you and my friend Swati. And so I'm glad our paths are crossing again.
Me too.
And, what I would like to talk about today are two big subjects. One is this whole question of DOGE and the Department of Government Efficiency. You have particular expertise here because you are the chief economist at the OMB, which has a lot of overlap here. And then second is the question of taxes, because we're about to hit tax season. And I'd love to just talk about who pays taxes, who doesn't, what are some of the myths and truths out there about the inequalities of our tax system. But let's start actually with the question of DOGE. And your particular area of expertise here is infrastructure spending. You've been writing a lot about infrastructure, and you wrote a piece in The Hill with the title, something to the effect of DOGE can help infrastructure problems or make them far worse. And I think a good starting point here would be just what the problems are. Like, why is it so much slower and more expensive to build public infrastructure in the United States?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's a very important one. The facts are quite stark. Based on work that I've done, the cost of building have increased dramatically in the U.S. over time. For building interstate highways in the 1960s, it was about $8.5 million per mile. By the 1980s, it was more than 3 times as much per mile, and it's gone up even more after that. And it's like basically the same mile of highway as a highway, and it's just increasingly in cost. To build rail within cities, we are about 3 times as expensive as the average rich or upper middle income country. We're about 6 times as expensive as some countries like Spain or Portugal or South Korea. And if we could be getting 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times as much per infrastructure dollar, we'd be having a much more effective government and have much better infrastructure. So what underlies this? I think there are 3 main issues that cause these high costs. Number one is litigiousness and proceduralism. The U.S. Tends to operate in ways that involve lots of litigation and also lots of procedures. In Europe, there tends to be more deference to bureaucrats who can kind of make a call rather than in the U.S. There tend to be like 500 boxes to check to get a project out the door. And the litigation and the box checking kind of drive up costs because often you're not optimizing for the best project, you're optimizing for box checking and litigation minimizing. And there are good reasons to have litigation in boxes. You want to stop corruption, things like that, but it's possibly kind of gone too far. Second is weak state capacity, not having enough staff, not having well enough paid staff, and as a result, kind of outsourcing too much to the private sector in ways that it makes it hard for us to manage. This is, of course, made worse by problem number one, which is that there's a lot more for people in government to do because they have so many procedures to go through and have face this litigation gauntlet. Issue number 3 is the federalism that we have in this country. It's in our Constitution, but I think it's often the case that we implement it poorly. We're sometimes way too decentralized to make the green transition, or to undergo the green transition. We're going to have to build lots of interstate, kind of long electrical lines from where renewables are produced to where it's consumed. Currently, that's all very decentralized. It's very, very hard to get buy-off from 70 different communities in order to do it. That needs to be centralized if we're ever going to succeed. Other times, we're way too centralized. As I point out in this op-ed, we're trying to rebuild some rail bridges in Connecticut, and as I understand it, the U.S. Coast Guard is saying that because one boat goes out once a year and in once a year, we need to spend extra hundreds of millions of dollars to make the bridge movable for this one boat. So I think if we could, kind of peel away at these issues of, 1, litigation and proceduralism, 2, state capacity, and 3, kind of poorly implemented federalism, we could make a lot of progress here.
And I think the most counterintuitive and surprising of those three is number two. So I think if you were to, even listeners to this podcast, because we've done a lot of local stories, for instance, the New York City subway, where we interviewed the New York Times reporters who wrote that article years ago about the most expensive mile of subway in the world and all that. And they were focused on issues of procurement, labor issues, sort of discrete interests who are really good at, maximizing their political hand to get really, really big contracts, which some of that I think is related to the point that some of this is outsourced. Like a lot of these people are not necessarily government employees, but they're government contractors masquerading as government employees. But I think to the average listener, especially center and center-right folks who hear number two, would be surprised because I think they think that we have too many people on the payroll of government.
Yeah. We have too little government line is not a popular one, and so the fact is we're just not talking about giant numbers of people here, but we are talking about giant amounts of money spent. So I think that there are kind of two forms of evidence here that are helpful. The first are case studies, and the second is more systematic economic evidence. So if you look at a couple of mega projects, they're just like, it's really, really clear how we have lax state capacity and how the problems that it's led to. So one is the Green Line, a light rail outside of Boston. And this is, very, very expensive project, billions of dollars. And for large parts of it, there were between 4 and 6 state employees that were managing this. And that's just not going to go well. It's just not possible to manage something of that complexity with so few government workers. And listen, these things are basically all built by the private sector, shovels in the ground, all private sector. So no one's saying that we need government employees actually putting the shovels in the ground, but you need decent people, you need enough people internally to manage the people on the outside, or else you're going to make the wrong decisions. You're going to change your mind, end up redoing things, which are very expensive. You're going to direct them the wrong way. You're going to be kind of maybe led along too much by consultants who have an incentive to spend more time doing things since they get paid more. Another example is California high-speed rail, especially at the outset, that's an even bigger project. Had very, very, very few people. And their own audits say this. They had way too few people, like a couple dozen. And many of them were working, some of them were working part-time. And they started doing things before the plans were done in some cases. And, that results in really costly changes to plans, and, stopping the shovels in the ground is very, very expensive. So these are the kinds of things that you just need more people who are paid enough. And so we're not talking about giant numbers of people. We're just talking about modest numbers of people to get things done. So those are case studies. You can also look at basic economic evidence. We've seen large declines in employment in state departments of transportation over the last quarter century. And 20% declines, large numbers of work, many fewer workers now than we did, even as the scope of what they're doing has expanded. As might be intuitive, these workers do something, they produce useful things. It is the case, this is a correlation, if a state increases its staffing by 1 Department of Transportation worker per 1,000 residents, its cost of construction go down by 26%. So more workers lead to better planning, better management of contracts once they're on the ground, and plausibly lower costs, or lower costs as a correlation. We also have new evidence that we're going to put out very soon that shows that when folks retire from their jobs, and this is of course very relevant to what's going on in DOGE of the government now, when 1% of state Department of Transportation employees retire in California, We see costs go up by a few percent. We see the duration of projects go up by a few percent, and we see cost overruns go up by a few percent. So like these workers are doing important things. And when you retire, in the case of DOGE, perhaps through kind of forced retirements, then we might be being penny wise and pound foolish by kind of losing the capacity of folks to deliver projects at reasonable cost, reasonable speed.
Now, what's interesting about what you just said is, the anecdotes that you were sharing are state agencies. And what I find surprising about that is those are blue states. What's going on in the politics? Because you would expect blue states to be a little bit more full throttle on adding staff to anything, right? Democrats just tend to be more government friendly. Why is it that they're starving these particular agencies? Are the politics just not in favor of long-term planning?
I think it's a great question. And I would love to see more reporting on it. And this is not my deepest area of expertise as an economist, but I have my guesses. So first, I think descriptively, you're 100% right. And in fact, in Massachusetts, the Green Line case, it was Charlie Baker, a Republican, that got the project going again. His state DOT, Department of Transportation commissioner, was a longtime Democrat, but it was a Republican governor who got that back on track. So what's going on? I think it is the case that in some cases, Democratic states are not doing enough to invest in the bureaucracy. There's been some reporting in Connecticut that we are balancing the budget in part on the backs of not hiring enough people, perhaps not even filling positions that are open. In Connecticut, that's partly the case because we have a really, really big, we have a lot of debt. We're the third most indebted state in the country. Democratic states do often have large debt. So we have these problems that you can ameliorate the debt in the short run by hiring fewer people. In terms of the overall political economy, and this is not a blue state, red state issue, but it is a state issue. The voters are often not super attentive to these issues, like the number of employees working in a state, like the state capacity. Like number one, these are kind of obscure issues to begin with. Number two, the costs of the downsides of these things often are way in the future. So some of these projects are kind of planned badly. And you might see that 5 years in the future when current leadership is no longer in power. So I think that the incentives are often not there to maintain strong capacity. It's part of what concerns me what's going on in the federal government now. It is going to be problematic that some of these departments are being potentially gutted and have many fewer employees. That doesn't mean we're going to see problems in the next year, even the next 2 years. That does not mean that there are not significant long-term effects. Now, none of what I was saying is to cast aspersion on particular states or particular parties, but I think that those are kind of the core underlying problems. All that said, European countries have stronger state capacity. They probably have similar sets of incentive. They have similar electorates. So it's not like these problems are insuperable, even though these problems are there.
Yeah, so, in focusing on that second rationale, right, the second driver of our infrastructure problems is a window to talk about DOGE, right? And I think before we really get into the promise and perils of DOGE, it's probably helpful to put on your OMB hat here and just explain to the audience how where the money is in the federal government, and, paint, do a little sort of a big picture pie chart of the different types of spending in the federal government, from debt service to entitlements that are untouchable to other discretionary spending. Let's start there, because then we can talk about what kind of impact they can have.
Yeah, great. So like I said, I was the chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget in 2022, 2023. So I spent some time thinking about these issues. When you look at federal spending and look at the numbers, which are out there and easy to access reports, notwithstanding some of what Elon Musk and others have been saying recently. Like the biggest sources of spending are entitlement programs. They are Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. Number one being Medicare and Social Security. So these are things that are in statutes and require that taxes are collected from workers and are transferred to retirees, or collected from workers and transferred to folks who need medical care, retirees or otherwise. And that's a lot of where the money is. For Social Security, there's very little that DOGE could do for Medicare, Medicaid. The U.S. has high healthcare spending, and we could talk about the others are expert in those things, but there are things we can do to reduce our medical spending.
And it's interesting, the guy who is reported to be the sort of quasi head of DOGE is a healthcare executive who was formerly at the head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So you could imagine that they're going to zero in on potential Medicaid and Medicare fraud there. Do you have any sense of whether you think there's a lot of money there to be pulled back?
So there's some great work coming out of BU Business School showing there's fraud, and there are definitely billions of dollars that we could reduce spending by. Fraud can be hard to detect. It's not. Folks have been trying to do that for many years, but there's definitely scope to do that. There are other things that are just not necessarily great uses of spending. In Connecticut, we spend a lot of money on nursing homes, more money than other states. Does that make sense? It might not. And that's not fraud. It's not abuse necessarily, but it may not be the most effective use of limited government funds. And these are the kinds of things that are worth looking into. Even beyond fraud. A lot of what the focus has been on thus far is not Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and not the next largest expense, which is the Department of Defense, about $900 billion a year. But the actually pretty small remaining part, which is what's called non-defense discretionary spending. So this is USAID. This is the amount of money that we spend at the Internal Revenue Service collecting taxes. This is my salary when I was working at the White House. This is not that big. It's a quite small fraction of all spending. It is less than we spend on defense and other security-related measures, and way less than we spend on defense and other security-related measures, plus Medicare, plus Medicaid, plus Social Security. So to the extent that what DOGE is focusing on is non-defense discretionary spending, there's, again, I definitely don't want to claim that there aren't ways in which we can improve efficiency, but it is the case that it's a small minority of overall federal spending, and to really deal with the long-term issues that we face with debt, which I think are real issues. Currently, we have a 7% debt to GDP ratio, which is a lot. 7% deficit. We have 100% debt to GDP ratio, roughly. We will almost certainly need some combination of increased revenues, potentially some reform of entitlements, and potentially some increases in growth that could help, but it is mathematically impossible for non-defense discretionary spending to come anywhere close to closing the budget deficit.
Well, here's my worry about all of this, right, is that there's all this sort of flash in marketing about all of these cuts that are happening. And I have these people in my life who are, trafficking in these memes that seem to suggest that there's a lot of waste being cut and that we're returning money to the taxpayers is how this is being framed ahead of legislation coming on the Hill to likely decrease taxes, right? Now, it seems very likely to me, and you could check my math on this, like back of the envelope, that after these cuts and a tax cut bill, taxpayers are actually going to be on the hook long-term for more than they would before all of this, meaning the deficit will be worse after this first few months of the Trump administration, potentially far, far worse, especially if you take into account any collection issues that happen at the IRS, such that like the fastest growing federal program, I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard it said that the fastest growing federal program is the debt itself. So check me on this. Am I wrong to be worried about this?
So I think that what you're saying is just obviously correct on the basis of the plans that Republican members of Congress are currently putting out. They're saying that they want to have giant tax cuts, which would cost $4 or $5 trillion over the next decade. And that's just extending the current Trump tax cuts. There's some discussion of adding on new tax cuts, not taxing Social Security, not taxing tips, which would add trillions of dollars more to the debt. For context, our current debt's about $30 trillion. So adding on like several $trillion more debt is a lot. That's a lot. There's some talk of cuts. So they might cut some of the clean energy tax credits, which I think would be a mistake. But if all you care about is the debt, then that would be pursuant to those cuts would be pursuant to that goal. There's some talk of cuts in Medicaid. Some cuts in Medicaid could potentially reduce waste, fraud, and abuse. Other cuts would harm some of the most vulnerable members of society, and if done with the sledgehammer, is very likely to harm the healthcare of the most vulnerable people in society, including children. And given the magnitude of cuts that they're talking about, it's hard to see how that's not what happens. There are these kind of cuts or proposed cuts to certain government programs, such as USAID. My view, Ravi and I are both graduates of law school. My view is that these cuts are both unlawful as a matter of statute, and further unconstitutional as a matter of separation of powers. Even if they are lawful, they are just puny compared to the 4 or 5 or more $1 trillion tax cuts. And even if you add up these puny changes to non-defense discretionary spending and these possibly large, possibly draconian changes to Medicaid and a handful of other things that they're talking about, you still end up with trillions of dollars more in debt added to future generations of taxpayers. And I have seen absolutely no plan coming out of Republican members of Congress that comes anywhere close to dealing with the debt and deficit issue that they say that we have. Quite to the contrary, they appear to be making it substantially worse.
And when you look at DOGE, what strategy, if any, could you discern at this point? Because you wrote in your piece basically that they could, DOGE actually could help solve, some of the, some of those drivers of, high infrastructure costs or inefficiency in other programs, right? Like, Democrats, I think, even Democrats are frustrated by the fact that whether it's broadband spending or infrastructure spending or the electric vehicle charging stations, there's like one program after another appears to be so slow coming out of the Biden administration and predates Biden. It's just like everything feels like it takes too long. And there's like a general sense out there that the government could be more efficient and more responsive. So in your piece, you say, okay, there's a world where DOGE, and then you wrote that in December, there was a world where DOGE could be a real, center of, driver of change, positive change, or it could make things a lot worse. What strategy have you discerned so far from them?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that they have not done the make things better strategy. So I wrote that piece in December in a hopeful in a hopeful way. Listen. I think anyone who's spent time in government, spent time thinking about it, wants it to work better. I think that there are reasonable changes that could be made that would result in infrastructure being built more quickly, result in kind of a more effective government. And so those things are hard because there often are good reasons why we have those rules in place, but perhaps they've accumulated so much that they, when you add them all up, are kind of self-defeating. So there was a hope that DOGE could actually focus on efficiency, on getting more bang for the buck from government dollars. What I have seen is not that. It is quite the contrary. He appears to be pushing out some of the DOGE in the Trump administration, pushing out some of the most effective, highest ranking government bureaucrats, government civil servants, and this is. But not actually looking for. Thus far, I'm unaware of any specific inefficiencies that they have found. They appear to just be trying to get rid of people, or shutting down departments in I believe clearly unlawful ways. So listen, there's a lot of potential here, and I hope that whenever the next administration comes around, there actually is a Department of Government Efficiency that, or I wouldn't call it that, but like something that, like a serious effort to work on these issues so that government can deliver better. But at this point, it's one, unlawful in many cases, but two, penny wise, pound foolish. Like you get rid of these people, and like they're doing important things, and at some point, we'll end up with higher cost infrastructure or services that don't work as well. And in just the way that I've shown in the case of infrastructure, when those people retire in California, end up with slower projects, more expensive projects. And listen, I don't want to suggest that there are not some government workers that are not great, but I can speak to my experience working at the Office of Management and Budget. Those folks are amazing. They are so talented and so dedicated, and we are so lucky to have them here, have them working for us, at least for the moment. And listen, if people like that are pushed out across governments, it's going to make the country worse off. And it's been sad to see that be the focus rather than trying to find actual, real inefficiencies to make government work better.
Yeah, what I'm seeing on the internet right now, and I haven't done a comprehensive look yet, everything's moving so fast, as to, take USAID, for example. Like, I haven't done a deep dive into what USAID has or has not been spending money on. I know there are big ticket items like PEPFAR and efforts to basically keep entire societies from creeping back into AIDS epidemics that I think is very good use of money. And then there are these anecdotes I read about, like some random theater program in, Ireland or something. Like, I don't even know if this is right, but like a trans theater program in Ireland or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I could see how you could put that to the American public and they'd be like, I'm not sure that's a good use of American taxpayer dollars. I haven't done the sort of analysis to be like, how many of those theater programs exist out there relative to PEPFAR? And again, like if they're, no doubt they're going to find stuff that are programs that should be cut. And it's probably right that Democrats should be way more aggressive in rooting out this kind of stuff, because if Democrats are the party of government, they should be as invested as anybody in making sure that government is efficient and works well and is responsive to the voters. But I share your concern, which is I came in here being like, okay, there's a version of the story that is actually like, a party is just willing to cut through the noise and say, all right, like there's all this sort of politeness out there and we're just going to actually ask the impolite, truthful questions. And I just haven't gotten the sense that truth and consistency is a priority right now amongst that group of people. I think like a good example was the condoms thing with the Hamas, right? There was some kind of like claim that Elon Musk was making about condoms going to Hamas or something. And he just casually dismissed the fact that he'd been like basically parroting this falsehood. And I'm like, that's not a small thing when you're acting as fast as you are to cut a whole bunch of things, including laying off nuclear, employees who are like safeguarding our nuclear arsenal and laying off people at the Department of Transportation at a time when we're seeing an uptick in air traffic issues and, safety concerns, and cutting off funding for programs in sub-Saharan Africa that people depend upon for life-saving drugs, and then having to make emergency declarations to get that funding going, but you're impacting nonprofits that are on thin budgets. Like, you go through all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, yeah, actually, I need my person who's in charge of all this to be very careful about what is true and what is not, and to be somebody who's an upstanding citizen, which used to be a requirement to work in government, would be that you're the type of person who that can pass a background check, has no conflicts of interest, and is somebody who, once you enter government, you try to be there for all Americans, not just a particular political party or not. And I'll get off my soapbox here, Zach, but I am concerned with the lack of rigor and integrity from the people running that office.
Yeah. So I share all those concerns. I mean, it is gut-wrenching to see these headlines daily, and it's also the most important thing is the unlawfulness and the harm to the folks who benefit from these programs, but it's also just a major missed opportunity that government efficiency should be is a good thing. And it's definitely the case that IT can help, but unfortunately, that is not what we're seeing. It does not. My read is that DOGE has not been on the level. They are not doing what they are saying they are doing. They talking about cutting the debt, cutting the deficits, and so fine. They unlawfully cut $40 billion of USAID spending. I think that's first of all, it's very unlikely to be held up because it's unlawful, probably unconstitutional. We're spending, trillions of dollars a year on entitlement programs. I'm not saying the entitlement program should be cut, but just like if you spend 3 minutes or 30 seconds looking at the federal budget, you'll see that we spend just a tiny amount or tiny share of federal spending on foreign aid, and like it's just cutting foreign aid or things like it is just going to come nowhere close to putting a dent in the debt. And that's before getting into how much of a bad idea it is to be cutting these programs, which are very important to our foreign policy. Not to mention, people who really, really need this help for their health to stay alive all around the world.
Yeah, here's what really bothers me about this is that they're packaging themselves as these truth tellers, right? And we've already stipulated to the fact that they're not on the level on the deficit, right? They're the average person who voted for Trump thinks that the sum total of these first few months will be that we're in a better position on the deficit, which unquestionably we will be worse if any legislation makes its way through Congress, but maybe even without, given some of the changes that can happen within the Internal Revenue Service, right? So that's one. The second is that instead of actually getting up and saying what they believe, which is that we should reform entitlements, they want to bankrupt the government. Part of their strategy is increase the deficit so that in future generations, the government is essentially bankrupt and staring down bankruptcy, and some future administration has to worry about the trade-offs that they're unwilling to bring to the American public and make themselves today, when we actually are in a much better position to solve those. That's the problem I have.
Yeah, if you look at where we got to where we are in terms of having a 100% debt to GDP ratio, the reason that we got here relative to where we were in 2000, which was when it was looking like debts were not going to be
lockbox,
not going to be such a big deal, was that we had the Bush tax cuts, in that we had more of the Bush tax cuts, in that we had the extension of the Bush tax cuts, and
we had the
Trump tax cuts, and then we had two wars, and we had the global financial crisis and a pandemic. But arguably the biggest share of that are those tax cuts. And that's just mechanically, if you add up, that's how we got to where we are. And now the solution to this problem is to do the exact same thing that got us into the problem in the first place, which is more tax cuts. And listen, I care a lot about inequality. I care about the debt. I care about having an adequately funded federal government that provides services. We need more revenue, not less revenue. And it is astonishing from my perspective, given the stated goals of concern with the debt and having an effective government, that the solution to this is yet more tax cuts, which again are probably the biggest reason that we've gotten to this problem in the first place.
Well, let's talk quickly before I let you go about taxes. So you wrote a piece recently about this progressivity of the tax code and the fairness of the tax code. And I think to start, there's this statistic out there that I think wouldn't surprise people, and I want to dispense with it really quickly, which is from 2014 to 2018, you take Bezos, Musk, and Warren Buffett, three of the richest people in the world. Their combined assets grew $137 billion over that 4-year period. But their income, as recognized by the tax code, only grew $5.7 billion, or their income was $5.7 billion. You point this out, but you also mention that this is somewhat of an outlier that I think drives people's perceptions about what the average rich person in this country goes through.
Yes. So this is a new paper on kind of how the rich get richer and how much of this is taxed. And and here's what we find. We find that for the top 1% of wealth holders in the U.S., that if you add together and count as income the ways in which their wages and their dividends and their realized capital gains, but also add in the increase in the value of their stocks and other assets that are not sold, but if you count that as income, then top 1% is taxed on 60% of what we're calling economic income, which means that they're not taxed on 40% of it. For the top 21%, and similarly for the top 400 richest folks in the country, they're taxed in about half of their economic income. So each year, their wages and dividends and realized gains add up to half their economic income, and the other half is, Jeff Bezos owns Amazon stock and it goes up in value and he doesn't sell it, or Elon Musk, owns SpaceX stock and it goes up in value and he doesn't sell it. So, is 50%, 60% high or low? Like, that's going to depend on the eye of the beholder. Like, obviously, a large share, 40 or not being taxed on 40 or 50% of your economic income is a lot. But it does say that I've written proposals on how we might want to tax that untaxed part. But something that it does say that 50 or 60% is already taxed, that if you just raise rates on the existing base, you're going to be taxing like most of their economic income. You're going to be missing a huge amount. But just raising rates, which is clearly constitutional, and in some cases
way simpler to do, right? Unrealized gains is a really hard thing to get at. Correct me if I'm wrong.
There are big debates on how to tax unrealized gains or wealth. No country in the world does much to tax unrealized gains. I think there's strong arguments for it, but the Biden administration had a proposal to do that. But we view our paper as a hopeful paper, because without doing that, we can still get. We miss a lot if you even captures the economic income, but you can still get most for at least the top 1% of wealth holders. So, in terms of how Democrats think about that going forward, in terms of they think about where the money is at the top, there like a higher share there is a higher share is already in the tax base than at least what people like me thought.
Now, to review those numbers, so if you're in the 90th to the 99th percentile, about 75% of your gains are captured. 99th to the 99.9th, 67%, and 0.1%, 50%. If you're like in the median, what does that percentage look like? Is that close to 100?
Yeah. So for most people, it's close to 100.
Unless you have a 401k, right? So if you're like in a 401k scenario, it's a little different.
Yeah. So for most people, their income is overwhelmingly wages, and they don't have that much in savings outside of Social Security. Yeah, which
savings is still taxed on a yearly basis, right?
Yeah. So like if you've got like a savings account, you get interest in your savings account, you're going to be taxed on it. If it's a 401k, it won't be taxed. Though it is taxed when you withdraw it. A big issue with the super rich, as opposed to your middle income American, is yes, middle income American will save some, then they will withdraw it and they will pay tax on it. That is different from the super duper rich. Many of them will die with tens or in some cases hundreds of billions of dollars of appreciated assets and pay zero income tax on that. So, middle income taxpayer, his stocks go up in value, he retires, he sells the stock, he pays tax on it. Very different for billionaires. Many of them are going to get rich and never going to sell it, and they might pay estate tax, but they're not going to pay income tax. But so there's kind of a fundamentally unequal treatment, though, between average taxpayer, stocks go up in value, sells it, pays tax, and rich people who are able to save a lot because they have so much money.
And so it seems like it's more of a problem of the 0.1 to 0.01 or whatever point, infinity to the small degree taxpayer versus the 1%, which is that 75% of assets. Like it's like so much less of an issue. Still an issue as you describe, if that's something you care a lot about.
Yep.
If that's something
Yeah,
you
for the
want to
top
stop.
1%, it's 50-50. For the 1% minus the top 0.1%, it's 2/3. You mentioned at the beginning or 5 minutes ago, kind of the problem with kind of keying off of particular examples. We view it as a benefit to kind of look at everyone. And it is, even when you look at the top 0.1%, Elon Musk is not necessarily representative in terms of his taxed income each year. I don't want to minimize his problems. I just want to kind of present the numbers that are out there and suggest that while unrealized gains are a big problem and many of us might want to tax them, raising rates is more effective than I would have thought.
Yeah, and I think there are independent reasons why one could key in on those few people at the top, concentration of power and corruption and things like that. Not talking about any one particular person, but there are public policy reasons and ethical reasons why one would be concerned about that small group. But I think from a fiscal policy perspective, as you point out, the picture's a little bit more complicated. One last piece on this before I let you go, which is talk a little bit about this idea of buy, borrow, die, like this idea that there's a sort of methodology of the rich and what the reality really says.
Yeah. So first, I totally agree. There might be reasons to focus on the very tippy top for reasons other than just kind of looking at where the money is. So on buy, borrow, die. So we've been talking a lot about how the rich get richer and often they don't sell. They just save because they own stocks that go up in value. This then raises the question, like, how do they consume? Like, where do they get the money from if they're not selling their stocks? A widely held view, if you look in any major publication, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., like they all have their articles saying like this is the way that rich people avoid paying taxes. They get a stock, often through founding a company, it goes up in value, and they borrow against that, don't pay any tax, and then they die because they're not taxed on gains at death because it's step up in basis at death for the reasons we were discussing before. Our paper quantifies this for the first time. And the reality is, it is the case. There's lots of borrowing by the super rich, the trillions of dollars. At the same time, as a share of economic income, as we've been defining it, it's quite small. It's like 1 or 2% of economic income. This thing gets back to the question that I asked 2 minutes ago. How are they consuming? If they're just saving? Well, this gets back to the question that Ravi asked me about at the very beginning, or 10 minutes ago. It turns out they actually have a decent amount of income that they're already being taxed on, and they can just consume out of that. And when you're super duper rich, you save a lot. So when you combine for the super rich two things, number one, they actually have a fair amount of liquid income that they're already being taxed on because they have wages, they have dividends. Many of them are people in finance or doctors or dentists. If you're talking about the top 1%, even in the top 0.1% or even the Forbes 400, they still have wages and dividends, and sometimes they sell stock. So when you combine kind of pretty high liquid income with, on the other hand, pretty high savings rates, so they don't actually need to have that much liquid income each year. They don't need to borrow. So again, there's a lot of borrowing out there, but the overwhelming way that the rich avoid paying taxes, apart from outright tax evasion, is not by borrow die, it's by save die. They get the asset and they just save. And they save because you only need so many yachts and homes, and it's like they only need to consume so much. And it's just a fact, rich save a lot.
Well, Zach, this is enlightening, man. Thanks for coming on. Where can folks find your work?
Look me up, Zach Liscow. I'm at Yale. My papers are all there.
All right, sir. Well, I really appreciate it.
It's a delight to be here. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Well, with that, thank you everybody for listening. Remember, rate, review, subscribe. Throw up a qualitative review for us on there if you haven't yet on either Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Our voicemail is 321-200-0570, and our email is lostdebate@thebranchmedia.org. You can check out our YouTube page at YouTube/@lostdebate. We'll put a link in the show notes to that. And you can also follow me on Goodreads if you haven't yet. I'll put that link also in the show notes. Thank you very much, everybody.